It all started with a letter. Not the kind of letter that warms your heart, like a handwritten note from an old friend, or even the kind of letter that ruins your day, like a bill you forgot to pay. No, this was the kind of letter that makes you question the sanity of everyone around you. A letter from my HOA. Yes, that HOA, the Homeowners Association. The self-appointed overlords of suburban America, armed with clipboards and a God complex. The letter read, "Dear Mr. Jack Thompson, as per section 14.3b of the HOA Covenants, Conditions and Restrictions, CC and RS, we are temporarily requisitioning the unused portion of your backyard for community events and private gatherings. This decision is final and non-negotiable. Thank you for your cooperation in maintaining the harmony of our neighborhood." I stared at the paper, blinking slowly like it might spontaneously combust if I looked hard enough. My backyard? My personal backyard? The one I bought with my own money? The one where I planned to build a fire pit and sip whiskey under the stars? That backyard? Apparently, it was now the HOA's personal party venue. Now, I'm not a man who angers easily. As a federal prosecutor, I've spent years dealing with hardened criminals, shady politicians, and corporate fraudsters without so much as raising my voice. But this was an affront to every fiber of my being. It wasn't just about the land, it was about principle. And if there's one thing you don't mess with, it's a man's principles, or his whiskey plans. I decided to investigate further before losing my cool. Maybe this was all just a misunderstanding. Some clerical error by Karen from the HOA board who spends her weekends alphabetizing her spice rack. So I called the HOA office. "Hello, this is Linda," chirped a voice on the other end of the line. "Hi, Linda," I said, trying to keep my tone civil. "This is Jack Thompson from 42 Maple Drive. I received a letter about my backyard being used for community events." "Oh yes," she said brightly. "We're so excited. The first event is a wine-tasting soiree next Saturday." "A wine-tasting soiree," I repeated slowly, as if saying it out loud would make it sound less insane. "Yes, it's going to be fabulous," Linda gushed. "We'll have live music, charcuterie boards, and even a chocolate fountain." "Well, that sounds lovely," I said through gritted teeth. "But why is it happening in my backyard?" "Oh, it's all in the CC and RS," Linda replied breezily. "Section 14.3b. You signed it when you moved in." Ah yes, the CC and RS, the sacred text of suburban tyranny. I vaguely remembered skimming through them when I bought the house. But who actually reads those things? They're like terms and conditions for your mortgage. Long, boring, and written in legalese so dense it could crush a small child. "I see," I said slowly. "And what happens if I don't agree to this?" There was a pause on the other end of the line, a pause so pregnant it could have given birth to triplets. "Well," Linda said finally, her tone now tinged with condescension, "you'd be in violation of HOA rules, which could result in fines or legal action. Fines or legal action. For not letting strangers guzzle Merlot on my lawn." This was no longer just an annoyance. This was war. I hung up and immediately dug out my copy of the CC and RS from a dusty box in my garage. Sure enough, there it was, Section 14.3b, buried between clauses about acceptable paint colors and lawn maintenance schedules. It stated that unused portions of private property may be temporarily requisitioned for community use at the discretion of the HOA board. Unused portions? Discretion? Who decides what's unused or what counts as discretion? Karen from Spice Rack HQ? The more I read, the angrier I got. This wasn't just overreach. This was outright theft. Legalized by fine print and enforced by people who probably spent their free time knitting sweaters for their cats. But here's where they made their first mistake. They underestimated me. You see, most people would grumble quietly or maybe write an angry post on Nextdoor about HOA tyranny. But not me. Because unlike most people in this neighborhood, I happen to know exactly how to navigate legal loopholes and how to exploit them mercilessly. Their second mistake? Assuming I wouldn't fight back because they didn't know who they were dealing with. Jack Thompson, federal prosecutor by day and petty revenge enthusiast by night. I decided to bide my time, for now. Let them think they'd won this round while I prepared my counterattack. In the meantime, I did what any rational adult would do. I went outside and measured every square inch of my backyard with a tape measure. If they wanted to play dirty with technicalities like unused portions, then so would I. By midnight that same day, my backyard looked like something out of an overzealous DIY project gone wrong. There were garden gnomes everywhere, dozens of them, strategically placed to cover every so-called and used inch of space. Some were holding tiny signs that read, "Private property," or "No trespassing." Others were just there for moral support. The piece de resistance was an inflatable kiddie pool smack dab in the middle of my yard with a sign that read, "Future site of Jack's Zen Garden." Was it ridiculous? Absolutely. But did it technically make my backyard fully utilized? You bet your charcuterie board it did. The next morning, Linda called me back. "Mr. Thompson," she began hesitantly, "we noticed some changes to your backyard." "Yes," I said cheerfully. "I've decided to fully utilize every inch of my property." "Well," she stammered, "that might complicate things for our wine-tasting soiree." "Oh no," I exclaimed with mock concern. "I'd hate to inconvenience anyone." There was silence on her end as she processed what had just happened. "Let me get back to you," she said finally before hanging up. And just like that, round one went to me. But little did they know, this was only the beginning. Jack was no stranger to conflict, but dealing with the HOA was like stepping into a Kafkaesque nightmare where bureaucracy met absurdity, and then threw a wine-tasting soiree on his lawn. After his initial victory with the garden gnomes and inflatable kiddie pool, Jack thought he'd bought himself some breathing room. But the HOA wasn't done with him. Oh no, they were just getting started. And Jack was ready. The escalation began subtly, like the slow boil of a pot left unattended. First came the fines. A crisp, official-looking notice appeared in his mailbox. "Dear Mr. Thompson, you are hereby fined $200 for violating HOA landscaping guidelines by placing unauthorized decorations, garden gnomes, in your backyard." Jack stared at the notice, incredulous. Unauthorized decorations? Were they seriously policing ceramic gnomes now? He imagined a secret HOA task force armed with measuring tape and binoculars, sneaking through backyards under cover of darkness. But it didn't stop there. The next week, another fine arrived, $150 for failure to maintain harmonious aesthetics. This time, it was the kiddie pool. Apparently, bright blue inflatable pools clashed with the HOA-approved color palette of beige and muted green. Jack began to suspect that Karen, the HOA president, was personally offended by his existence. Karen was the kind of person who treated her role on the HOA board like she'd been elected to Congress. She wore power suits to community meetings and spoke in a tone that suggested she was one passive-aggressive comment away from declaring martial law. Jack had seen her in action before, berating neighbors for parking their cars half an inch over the driveway line or issuing warnings about unauthorized holiday decorations. She was relentless, and now she had set her sights on him. Jack decided it was time to dig deeper. He spent hours combing through the CC and RS, those sacred governing documents of suburban life. They were a labyrinth of legal jargon, filled with clauses about fence heights and acceptable shrub varieties. Somewhere in this mess, Jack knew he'd find the ammunition he needed to fight back. And then he found it. Section 8.2a, buried beneath rules about mailbox placement. It stated that any fines issued by the HOA must be accompanied by photographic evidence of the violation. Jack smirked. They hadn't sent him a single photo to justify their fines. He had them on a technicality, a deliciously petty technicality. Armed with this knowledge, Jack attended the next HOA meeting. It was held in the community center, a sterile room decorated with motivational posters about teamwork and success. Karen sat at the head of the table like a queen presiding over her court, flanked by her loyal subjects. Linda, who handled communications, Bob, who oversaw landscaping, and Susan, who seemed to exist solely to nod in agreement with Karen's every word. "Mr. Thompson," Karen said as Jack entered, her tone dripping with disdain. "I see you've decided to join us. I wouldn't miss it for the world." Jack replied cheerfully. The meeting began with Karen rattling off updates about upcoming events. The wine-tasting soiree, still scheduled for his backyard, a community potluck, and something ominously called Neighborhood Beautification Day. Then came the fines. As you all know, Karen began, we've had some issues with non-compliance recently. Jack raised his hand. Yes, Karen asked, clearly annoyed. I'd like to address my fines, Jack said. Karen sighed but gestured for him to continue. Well, Jack said, pulling out a copy of the CC and RS he'd highlighted like a college student cramming for finals. According to Section 8.2a, all fines must be accompanied by photographic evidence. Karen blinked. Excuse me? Photographic evidence, Jack repeated slowly for effect. You know, pictures proving that I violated your rules. Karen's face turned redder than the Merlot they were planning to serve at his backyard soiree. We don't need photographs, she snapped. Oh, but you do, Jack said innocently. It's right here in your own rules. The room fell silent except for Bob muttering something about needing more coffee. Karen tried to recover. Well, we'll provide photos moving forward. Great, Jack said brightly. And while we're at it, let's talk about Section 14.3b, the clause you used to seize my backyard. Karen shifted uncomfortably in her seat. It says, and used portions of private property, Jack continued. But my backyard is fully utilized. Garden gnomes, kiddie pool, the works. That's not what we meant by utilized, Karen snapped. Well, Jack said with mock seriousness. Perhaps you should clarify your language in future amendments. Linda scribbled furiously in her notebook while Bob stared at his coffee cup like it might rescue him from this disaster. Karen tried one last tactic. Intimidation. Mr. Thompson, she said coldly, if you continue disrupting our operations, we'll have no choice but to escalate this matter legally. Jack leaned forward, smiling like a cat who just cornered a particularly slow mouse. Funny you should mention legal matters, he said softly, because I happen to be very familiar with them. Karen froze. You see, Jack continued casually, I'm a federal prosecutor. The room collectively inhaled as if someone had just dropped an ice cube down their backs. And I've been looking into some irregularities with how this HOA operates, Jack added. Karen tried to maintain her composure but looked like she might spontaneously combust. Irregularities, Linda squeaked nervously. Oh yes, Jack said smoothly. Misuse of funds is a serious issue, not to mention selective enforcement of rules. Karen opened her mouth but no words came out. So here's what's going to happen, Jack said firmly. You're going to drop my fines and cancel your plans for my backyard, or I'll take this matter further. The silence was deafening except for Susan nervously tapping her pen against the table. Karen finally managed to choke out, We'll review your concerns. Wonderful, Jack said brightly as he stood up and walked out of the room like he owned it, which he did, at least his backyard portion of it. Round 2, victory secured with style points for good measure. Jack had won the second round, but he knew better than to underestimate the HOA. Karen and her merry band of clipboard-wielding tyrants weren't the type to back down quietly. No, they were plotting something. He could feel it in the air, like the faint smell of burnt toast before your smoke detector goes off. And Jack was ready for whatever came next. The first sign of retaliation arrived in the form of a surprise inspection. 2 HOA board members, Bob and Linda, showed up at Jack's house unannounced, armed with clipboards and expressions that suggested they'd rather be anywhere else. Bob, perpetually exhausted, looked like he'd been dragged out of bed for this. Linda, on the other hand, was trying her best to channel Karen's intimidating glare but ended up looking more like a confused squirrel. Mr. Thompson, Linda began, her voice trembling slightly, we're here to conduct a routine inspection of your property. Routine? Jack asked, raising an eyebrow. Funny. I don't recall hearing about this during the last HOA meeting. Linda shuffled nervously. It's a new initiative. Ah, Jack said, leaning against his doorframe with a grin. And what exactly are you inspecting? Bob cleared his throat and gestured vaguely toward Jack's backyard. Landscaping compliance. Jack smirked. Landscaping compliance? You mean my gnomes? Linda flushed. Among other things. Well, Jack said cheerfully, stepping aside to let them in. Be my guest. He watched as they awkwardly navigated his backyard, jotting down notes and snapping photos of his gnomes, kiddie pool, and newly installed tiki torches. Yes, tiki torches, because if they were going to accuse him of violating aesthetic guidelines, he might as well go all in. Bob paused by one particularly flamboyant gnome holding a miniature surfboard and sighed deeply. This one's creative. Thank you, Jack replied with mock sincerity. I call him Malibu Greg. Linda ignored the comment and scribbled furiously on her clipboard before announcing, We'll be submitting our findings to the board. Jack nodded solemnly. I look forward to hearing your expert analysis. As they left, Jack couldn't help but laugh. Landscaping compliance? Malibu Greg? This was amateur hour and he was just getting started. Later that week, Karen sent out an email blast to the entire neighborhood with the subject line, Urgent, Community Standards Update. The email contained a list of new rules that seemed suspiciously targeted at Jack. Among them were bans on inflatable pools, garden gnomes exceeding 12 inches in height, Malibu Greg was 14, and tiki torches deemed too festive. Jack read the email twice before bursting into laughter. Too festive? Was Karen allergic to joy? Did she break out in hives at the sight of whimsical decor? But then came the kicker. Karen announced that the wine-tasting soiree would proceed as planned, in his backyard, under the guise of a community improvement initiative. Apparently, hosting private parties on someone else's property now counted as improving the neighborhood. Jack decided it was time to escalate his counterattack. If Karen wanted war, she was going to get it, and he had just the plan. Step 1, research. Jack spent hours combing through public records about the HOA's finances and governance practices. What he found was both enlightening and infuriating. The HOA had been collecting exorbitant dues from residents under the guise of funding community projects. But most of that money seemed to disappear into vague administrative expenses. And then there were the kickbacks. Karen had been hiring her cousin's landscaping company for overpriced maintenance contracts without disclosing the conflict of interest. Step 2, allies. Jack started talking to his neighbors, quietly at first, to gauge their feelings about the HOA. What he discovered was a goldmine of resentment. Nearly everyone had their own horror story about Karen's reign of terror. Fines for having slightly overgrown hedges, warnings about parking too close to mailboxes, and even threats over holiday lights deemed too bright. One neighbor, Steve from down the street, confessed that Karen had once fined him $50 for leaving his trash cans out an hour past pickup time. An hour? Jack asked incredulously. Steve nodded grimly. She took photos as evidence. Jack shook his head in disbelief but knew he'd found his army. Step 3, action. Armed with evidence and support from disgruntled neighbors, Jack filed a formal complaint against the HOA with local authorities, and then sent copies of his findings to every resident in the neighborhood. The complaint detailed financial mismanagement, conflicts of interest, and selective enforcement of rules, all backed by documentation that would make even Karen sweat. The neighborhood erupted into chaos almost overnight. Residents began demanding answers from Karen during HOA meetings, flooding her inbox with angry emails, and even staging small protests outside her house, complete with signs reading, "Free Malibu Greg." Karen tried to maintain control by issuing more fines and threatening legal action, but it was clear she was losing her grip. Meanwhile, Jack prepared for what he knew would be the ultimate showdown. The next HOA meeting. The meeting room was packed, standing room only, with residents eager to confront Karen and her board members. Jack arrived early and took a seat near the front, watching as Karen tried, and failed, to maintain her usual air of authority. "Let's begin," she said stiffly, ignoring the murmurs of discontent around her. Before she could launch into her agenda, Jack stood up. "I'd like to address some concerns," he said loudly enough for everyone to hear. Karen glared at him but nodded reluctantly. Jack pulled out a stack of papers, the evidence he'd compiled, and began presenting his case point by point. Financial discrepancies in HOA budgets, conflicts of interest with landscaping contracts, arbitrary enforcement of rules, and misuse of private property, his backyard. By the time he finished speaking, the room was buzzing with outrage. Karen tried to respond but stumbled over her words as residents began shouting questions at her. "Where's our money going? Why are you fining us for ridiculous things? What gives you the right to use someone else's yard?" Bob looked like he wanted to crawl under the table while Linda nervously flipped through her notes. Finally, Karen snapped, "This is all nonsense. Mr. Thompson is just trying to undermine our authority." Jack smiled calmly and replied, "No, I'm just trying to hold you accountable." The room erupted into applause. Karen stormed out halfway through the meeting, but not before announcing that she would be consulting legal counsel again. Jack watched her leave with satisfaction. Round 3 belonged entirely to him, and Malibu Greg approved wholeheartedly from his spot in Jack's backyard. Jack's triumphant takedown of Karen and her HOA henchmen at the community meeting was the stuff of suburban legend. Neighbors were still buzzing about it days later, swapping stories over fences and at the local coffee shop. Jack had become something of a folk hero, a modern-day Robin Hood, stealing dignity from the rich, Karen, and redistributing it to the oppressed, everyone else. But while the neighborhood celebrated, Jack knew the battle wasn't over. Karen wasn't the type to go quietly into the night. She was the type to go kicking, screaming, and probably filing frivolous lawsuits. Sure enough, Karen's next move arrived in the form of a cease and desist letter. The envelope was thick, embossed with a gold HOA logo that looked suspiciously like a knockoff version of a government seal. Inside was a letter accusing Jack of defamation, harassment, and undermining community cohesion. It demanded that he retract his statements, pay $1,000 in fines for emotional damages, and remove Malibu Greg from his backyard immediately. Jack read through the letter twice, once to absorb its absurdity and a second time to laugh uncontrollably. Emotional damages? Malibu Greg? This was Karen's grand plan? He imagined her sitting at her kitchen table late at night, furiously typing out legal threats while sipping decaf tea and muttering about that troublemaker on Maple Drive. But Jack wasn't fazed. If anything, he found Karen's desperation amusing. He decided to respond in kind, with his own cease and desist letter, written in the most sarcastic legal tone he could muster. It began, "Dear Ms. Karen Whitaker, President of the HOA and self-appointed Queen of Suburbia," and went downhill from there. Jack outlined his grievances with bullet points labeled 1. Abuse of power, 2. Mismanagement of funds, and 3. General Karenness. He concluded with, "Should you wish to pursue this matter further, I welcome your legal counsel to contact mine." Spoiler alert, I am my legal counsel. Jack mailed the letter with a smile, imagining Karen's face when she opened it. He didn't have to wait long for her reaction. It came during an impromptu HOA board meeting held 2 days later. Karen had summoned her loyal followers, minus Bob, who had apparently resigned in disgrace, to discuss urgent matters threatening our community. Jack attended as an observer, sitting in the back row with a bag of popcorn like he was watching a particularly dramatic episode of reality TV. Karen opened the meeting with her usual flair for melodrama. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are under attack." Linda gasped audibly while Susan nodded solemnly. Karen continued, "Mr. Thompson has taken it upon himself to wage war against this association, against all of us." Jack raised an eyebrow but said nothing. "He has spread lies," Karen declared, pointing dramatically toward Jack as though he were a villain in a soap opera. "He has defied our rules. And worst of all, he has mocked our authority." Jack couldn't help himself. He whispered loudly enough for everyone to hear, "Guilty as charged." The room erupted into murmurs as Karen glared daggers at him. "We must take action," she said firmly. "We cannot allow one man to destroy everything we've built." Jack leaned forward, grinning. "What exactly have you built, Karen? A dictatorship disguised as community leadership." Karen ignored him and turned back to her audience. "I propose that we vote on new measures to strengthen our authority. starting with increased fines for non-compliance. That was the breaking point for the residents. One by one, they began voicing their frustrations about unfair fines, arbitrary rules, and Karen's blatant misuse of power. Steve from down the street stood up and said what everyone was thinking. "Karen, we're tired of this nonsense. You don't represent us. You represent yourself." The room erupted into applause. Karen looked like she might spontaneously combust but managed to stammer, I've always acted in the best interests of this community." Jack couldn't resist chiming in. "And by community, you mean your cousin's landscaping business?" More applause. Karen tried desperately to regain control but realized she was outnumbered. The residents demanded change, and they weren't going to stop until they got it. By the end of the meeting, Karen had been voted out as HOA president, a decision that felt less like democracy and more like poetic justice. Linda resigned shortly afterward, probably to escape further humiliation, leaving Susan as the sole remaining board member. Susan promptly announced that she would step down too, for personal reasons, and suggested that Jack take over as interim president. Jack blinked in surprise but quickly recovered. He stood up and addressed the room. "Thank you for your confidence in me, but I think we need real change here. Let's elect an entirely new board, one that actually listens to its residents." The crowd cheered as nominations began flying around the room. By the end of the night, a new board had been elected, comprised entirely of residents who had suffered under Karen's rule and were eager to restore sanity to their neighborhood. As Jack walked home afterward, he felt an overwhelming sense of satisfaction. Not just because he'd won, though that was pretty great, but because he'd helped his neighbors reclaim their voice. Malibu Greg greeted him from his spot in the backyard with a silent nod of approval. In the weeks that followed, things began to change for the better. The new HOA board eliminated unnecessary fines, revised outdated rules, and even refunded some misused funds back to residents. Jack's backyard was officially declared off-limits for community events, and Malibu Greg remained proudly on display. One day, Steve stopped by with a bottle of whiskey as thanks for everything Jack had done. "You really took them down," Steve said with admiration. Jack shrugged modestly but couldn't hide his grin. "Sometimes you have to fight fire with gnomes." And so life returned to normal, or as normal as it could be when you lived in a neighborhood once ruled by Karen Whitaker. The moral of the story? Never underestimate suburbanites or garden gnomes with a vendetta. And hey, if you enjoyed this tale of petty revenge against HOA tyranny, don't forget to like this video, share it with your friends who've suffered under their own Karens in charge, comment below about your favorite part, and subscribe for more suburban drama.